The scorching heat of sarin IV was unbearable by most species standards, but Colonel Adrian Shaw barely noticed it anymore. His combat suit's climate control had long since failed, and the relentless sun turned the air into something that felt like hot syrup. Around him, his unit worked quickly, erecting barriers and securing defensive positions against the oncoming forces of the Ralvek horde. The Terevani stood nearby, their iridescent carapaces shimmering faintly in the harsh light. As allies, they were tactically brilliant but notoriously cautious. Adrian had spent the better part of the week convincing them to hold the line on sarin IV. The Ralvek's invasion threatened a critical supply corridor, and retreat was not an option. Colonel Shaw Mazin, the Terevani commander, clicked through his translator. "You insist this position is defensible, yet your troops appear fragile. Are they capable of enduring what is to come?" Adrian turned to Mazin, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "Fragile, huh? Stick around and you'll see just how fragile we are." Mazin's antennae flicked uncertainly, but he didn't reply. Instead, he watched as Adrian's soldiers, their movements efficient despite their obvious exhaustion, fortified their position. An hour later, the first wave of Ralvek descended. The enemy resembled something out of a nightmare, hulking, quadrupedal beasts with segmented armor and serrated limbs designed to tear through steel. They moved with unnerving speed, a wall of claws and chitons surging across the barren plains. "Hold steady," Adrian barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony of growls and gunfire. The humans opened fire. Bullets and plasma rounds lit up the battlefield, cutting into the Ralvek ranks. Despite their fearsome appearance, the creatures fell under concentrated fire, but not before their sheer numbers reached the defensive line. Adrian saw Corporal Mendez go down first, a Ralvek's claw ripping through his shoulder. The corporal screamed but didn't stop fighting, his sidearm pumping round after round into the beast until it collapsed. Another soldier, Private Harris, was thrown against a barrier, his leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. He dragged himself back into position, propping his rifle on the edge of the barricade and continuing to fire. The Terevani, who had taken up a position just behind the humans, hesitated. Adrian could feel Mazin's eyes on him even as he fired his weapon, dropping another Ralvek. Colonel Shaw Mazin's voice buzzed through his translator. "Your soldiers are grievously injured. They should retreat and seek medical assistance." "No retreat," Adrian growled, slamming another magazine into his rifle. "They're still breathing. That's all they need." Mazin made a clicking sound that Adrian had come to recognize as confusion. "This is illogical. Pain is a signal to cease activity. To continue invites further damage." "Tell that to them," Adrian said, nodding toward Mendez, who had fashioned a crude sling for his arm and was now holding off 2 Ralvek with one hand. The second wave came harder than the first. The Ralvek were adapting, focusing their attacks on weak points in the human defenses. Adrian watched as Harris, his face pale from blood loss, gritted his teeth and lobbed a grenade into a cluster of charging beasts. The explosion tore through the enemy, but a shard of shrapnel embedded itself in Harris's side. He fell back, clutching his wound, but his voice rang out over the comms. "Lines holding, sir." Adrian felt a surge of pride and rage. "Keep it that way." The Terevani, meanwhile, were struggling to maintain their cohesion. One of their warriors, Ralvek, had taken a glancing blow from a Ralvek's claw, leaving a deep gouge in his carapace. Ralvek immediately collapsed, his limbs locking in what Adrian recognized as a defensive reflex. "Mazin, your people need to pull it together," Adrian snapped. "Ralvek is incapacitated," Mazin replied. "He cannot fight in this condition." "Tell him to get back on his feet," Adrian said. "We don't have time for this." Mazin's antennae twitched in dismay. He cannot. The injury compromises his structural integrity. Continuing to fight would be reckless. "Welcome to the party," Adrian muttered, stepping over a fallen Ralvek and firing into the next wave. Hours passed, and the battle raged on. The humans took hit after hit, their bodies battered and broken, but they didn't stop. Mendez, despite his shattered shoulder, rigged an improvised explosive to a barricade. Harris, pale and barely conscious, directed fire from his prone position. Even Adrian, his leg sliced open by a Ralvek's claw, refused to fall back. By the time the final wave broke, the battlefield was a smoking ruin. Adrian surveyed the scene, his chest heaving. The Ralvek were retreating, their forces decimated. Around him, his soldiers slumped against barriers, too exhausted to celebrate but alive. Mazin approached cautiously, his carapace scratched and dulled from minor impacts. He studied the humans with an intensity Adrian hadn't seen before. "You and your soldiers," Mazin said slowly, "have sustained injuries that would render most species incapacitated. Yet you continue to function. This defies our understanding of biological behavior." "It's not about biology," Adrian said, limping toward Mazin. "It's about survival. Pain's just part of the job." Mazin's antennae swayed in what Adrian guessed was disbelief. "This, resilience borders on madness. Your capacity to endure exceeds anything we have encountered." Adrian gave a tired smile. "Welcome to humanity." As medics began tending to the wounded, Mazin lingered, his multifaceted eyes scanning the battlefield. Finally, he turned to Adrian. "Colonel Shaw, I must confer with my council. This battle has raised questions." Adrian watched him go, then turned back to his soldiers. Despite the pain radiating through his body, he felt a grim satisfaction. The Terevani might not understand humanity yet, but they were starting to see what made them dangerous. The aftermath of the battle left little time for rest. The defensive outpost on Scifi, battered but still standing, had become a grim triage center. Medics rushed between makeshift cots, tending to soldiers whose injuries ranged from deep lacerations to broken bones. Adrian Shaw sat on the edge of a supply crate, his leg hastily bandaged by a corpsman. Blood seeped through the fabric, but he barely noticed. "What's the situation, Mendez?" he asked, glancing at the sergeant, who was cradling his injured arm in a sling. "Rough," Sir Mendez replied. "We lost about a third of the unit. The rest, well, they're in pieces, but they'll fight if they have to." Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. They'll have to. The Terevani were huddled near their own wounded, though their injuries were far fewer. Mazin stood apart, his antennae twitching erratically as he studied the humans. It was clear the battle had rattled him not because of the Ralvek, but because of what he had seen in the humans themselves. "Colonel Shaw," Mazin said, approaching cautiously, "your soldiers exhibit a pattern of behavior we cannot rationalize. They persist in combat despite significant impairment. Some have even continued after sustaining wounds that would be fatal to many species." "Yeah, that's called determination," Adrian replied, his tone clipped. Mazin tilted his head. "Determination? A form of chemical influence? Or neural override?" Adrian sighed. "It's neither. It's a choice. A mindset. When things get hard, we don't quit." "This concept of not quitting," Mazin said slowly, "it appears to override survival instinct. How is this beneficial?" Adrian leaned forward, fixing Mazin with a hard stare. Because sometimes survival isn't about staying safe. It's about pushing through the pain to get the job done. You don't survive a war by sitting out the tough parts. Before Mazin could respond, the distant rumble of approaching Ralvek forces interrupted them. The sound reverberated through the ground, growing louder with every second. "Looks like they're coming back for another round," Mendez muttered, glancing at the horizon. Adrian stood, wincing as pain shot through his leg. "Sound the alarm. Get everyone into position." The defensive line was hastily reinforced with what little remained of their resources. Barricades were patched with scavenged materials, and ammunition was rationed carefully. The soldiers, battered but resolute, took their places, their expressions grim but determined. The Terevani, however, hesitated. Mazin Adrian called, motioning the alien leader over. "Your people need to step up. We can't hold this line without you." Mazin's antennae twitched uncertainly. "We are not equipped for prolonged engagement. Our physiology does not permit sustained injury." "Then don't get injured," Adrian snapped. "But you're in this fight whether you like it or not." The Ralvek attacked with renewed ferocity. The ground shook under the weight of their charge, and their screeches pierced the air like a chorus of nightmares. Adrian's rifle barked as he fired into the advancing horde, each shot carefully aimed. The line held, but barely. A Ralvek leapt over the barricade, its claws raking across Mendez's torso before Adrian brought it down with a well-placed shot. The sergeant fell, blood pooling beneath him. Medic Adrian shouted, but Mendez waved him off, propping himself up against the barricade. "I'm not done yet," Mendez growled, grabbing a sidearm and firing into the fray. Nearby, Harris's leg, still mangled from the previous battle, was using the butt of his rifle to fend off a Ralvek that had gotten too close. He was pale, his movements sluggish, but his resolve never wavered. "Stay down, damn it," Harris shouted as he swung the rifle again, the impact cracking the creature's carapace. The Terevani, watching from their position, seemed paralyzed by what they were witnessing. Mazin's translator buzzed faintly as he muttered to himself, his antennae twitching erratically. Mazin Adrian shouted, reloading his weapon, "Get your people moving." The alien leader hesitated for a moment longer before finally giving the order. The Terevani moved into action, their energy weapons cutting through the Ralvek with surgical precision. But it was clear they were struggling to keep up with the relentless pace of the humans. As the battle dragged on, the Ralvek began to falter. Their numbers thinned, their attacks grew less coordinated, and finally they began to retreat. A cheer went up from the humans, though it was short-lived. The cost of the victory was evident in the bodies that littered the battlefield and the exhausted, wounded soldiers who remained. Adrian sank to the ground, his leg throbbing painfully. Around him, medics scrambled to tend to the injured. Mazin approached, his movements slow and deliberate. Colonel Shaw, Mazin said, his tone unusually subdued. "Your species continues to confound us. Your soldiers fought through injuries that should have rendered them incapable of action. Some even appeared to fight harder after being wounded. How is this possible?" Adrian leaned back against a piece of rubble, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because that's what it takes. When everything's on the line, you don't stop to think about how much it hurts. You just keep going." Mazin was silent for a long moment, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the carnage around them. Your pain tolerance is not a mere physical trait. It is something else, something we do not possess. "You've got your tactics, your precision," Adrian said. "We've got our stubbornness. Guess that's why we make a good team." Mazin's antennae twitched thoughtfully. "Perhaps there is more to your species than we anticipated." Adrian gave a tired smile. "You're just figuring that out now." As the sun set over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape, Adrian knew the fight wasn't over. The Ralvek would return, stronger and more determined than before. But for now, they had bought themselves a little more time and earned the respect of their alien allies. The night on Sarin IV was as hostile as its days, the temperature plummeting to sub-zero levels as if the planet sought to punish anyone foolish enough to remain. Fires from the battlefield flickered faintly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows over the wreckage and debris. Colonel Adrian Shaw sat near one of these fires, his leg freshly bandaged and his rifle across his knees. Around him, his soldiers rested where they could, their exhaustion evident in every movement. Adrian's comm unit buzzed, pulling him from his brief moment of silence. "Shaw here." "Sir, perimeter sensors are picking up movement," a weary voice crackled back. It was Lieutenant Crane, stationed at the northern watch point. Adrian stood with a grimace, his injured leg protesting every step. Ralvek. Unclear. Could be stragglers, could be a scout team. "I'll take a look," Adrian replied, signaling to Mendez. The sergeant, his torso swathed in bandages, joined Adrian without hesitation, his sidearm holstered but ready. The two made their way to the watch point, where a handful of soldiers were stationed with night vision scopes. Crane handed Adrian a scope and pointed toward the horizon. There, just past the third ridge. Adrian peered through the scope, his jaw tightening. A cluster of figures moved in the distance, their movements deliberate but not immediately threatening. They were too small to be Ralvek. He lowered the scope and turned to Mendez. "Let's go see what they want." The approach was slow and cautious, the cold air biting against their skin. When they finally closed the distance, Adrian recognized the figures as Terevani. Mazin was among them, his shimmering carapace dulled by the cold. Colonel Shaw, Mazin said as Adrian and Mendez approached. "We observed the sensors and chose to investigate. It seems your soldiers are indisposed. They're exhausted, Adrian replied flatly. What's your excuse for being out here? Mazen hesitated, his antennae twitching slightly. The Ralvek are regrouping. They will return by dawn. Adrian swore under his breath. How many? Our estimates suggest twice their previous force. Twice, Mendez muttered. We barely held them off the first time. Adrian ignored the comment, focusing on Mazen. If you've got anything up your sleeve, now's the time to share. Mazen's multifaceted eyes reflected the faint starlight as he responded. We have limited resources. Our war doctrines prioritize minimal losses, which does not align with your species' methods. Adrian let out a humorless laugh. You're saying we're too reckless. Not reckless, Mazen corrected. Extraordinary. And confounding. Adrian waved the compliment aside. What about reinforcements? Supplies? Anything? Mazen hesitated again. Reinforcements are en route but will not arrive in time. However, there is one option. A munitions cache was left on this planet decades ago. It could be enough to bolster your defenses. Then why are we just hearing about this now? Mendez asked, his frustration barely contained. The location of the cache is dangerous, Mazen replied. The terrain is treacherous, and the Ralvek have claimed much of it as hunting grounds. Adrian sighed. Dangerous or not, it's our best shot. Where's the cache, eh? Mazen extended a thin limb, gesturing to the east. 7 kilometers that way. Embedded in a ravine. 7 kilometers of Ralvek-infested hell, Mendez muttered. Perfect. We'll take a team, Adrian said, already mentally preparing. If we don't come back, hold the line as long as you can. Mazen's antennae flicked. You intend to lead this mission personally? You were injured, Colonel Shaw. Adrian gave a tired smile. It wouldn't be the first time. By the time Adrian's team was assembled, the temperature had dropped further, frost forming on their weapons and gear. Mendez, Harris, and 3 other soldiers joined him, their faces grim but resolute. Mazen, to Adrian's mild surprise, volunteered to guide them. The journey to the ravine was brutal. The rocky terrain was uneven and sharp, and every step felt like an invitation for the Ralvek to attack. The tension was palpable, every sound amplified by the silence of the frozen night. Halfway there, a guttural growl broke the stillness. The group froze, weapons raised. From the shadows, a Ralvek scout emerged, its serrated limbs gleaming in the moonlight. Take it down quietly, Adrian whispered, motioning to Harris. The private nodded, carefully lining up his shot. The suppressed round struck true, the creature collapsing with a soft thud. Nice work, Mendez muttered. Keep moving, Adrian ordered. The group pressed on, the ravine finally coming into view as dawn's faint light began to creep over the horizon. The cache was embedded in a sheer rock face, its metallic surface glinting faintly. That's it, Mazen said. All right, let's get to work, Adrian said, motioning for his team to set up a defensive perimeter. As they worked to access the cache, the telltale sound of approaching Ralvek grew louder. Adrian swore under his breath, signaling his team to prepare for combat. The first wave hit hard, the Ralvek leaping down from the rocky outcroppings above. Adrian's rifle barked as he dropped one, then another. Harris screamed as a claw raked across his back, but he spun around, firing point blank into the creature's face. Stay on them, Adrian shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Mazen and his Terevani warriors joined the fray, their energy weapons precise but lacking the human's ferocity. Adrian noticed Mazen pause briefly as one of his soldiers was struck down, the alien leader hesitating before resuming fire. Keep moving, Mazen, Adrian barked, covering him with suppressing fire. The fighting grew more desperate as the team worked to secure the munitions. Mendez, his injured arm still in a sling, used his free hand to lob grenades into the advancing horde. Harris, bleeding heavily, refused to fall back, his rifle spitting fire until the barrel overheated. Finally, the cache was opened, revealing a trove of explosives and heavy munitions. "Load up," Adrian shouted. The team worked quickly, distributing the weapons and laying down suppressing fire as the Ralvek closed in. When the last of the explosives were secured, Adrian gave the order to retreat. The journey back was a nightmare. The Ralvek pursued them relentlessly, their screeches echoing across the rocky plains. Adrian's leg burned with every step, and he could see the strain on his soldiers' faces. As they neared the defensive line, the sound of human gunfire reached their ears. The remaining soldiers had rallied, holding off the Ralvek long enough for Adrian's team to return. "Get those munitions into position," Adrian ordered as they crossed the barricades. The final battle was chaos. With the new weapons, the humans in Terevani were able to repel the Ralvek's assault, but the cost was high. By the time the last creature fell, the battlefield was littered with bodies, human and alien alike. Adrian, barely standing, turned to Mazin. "Now do you understand?" Mazin's antennae drooped slightly as he surveyed the carnage. "Your pain tolerance, your willingness to endure. It is unlike anything we have encountered. It is humbling." Adrian nodded, too tired to reply. The Terevani had finally seen what it meant to be human and why, against all odds, humanity refused to break. The battlefield on Scifi was deathly quiet in the aftermath of the final assault. Smoke rose in faint spirals from the shattered barricades, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the bloodied ground. Colonel Adrian Shaw leaned against a battered metal slab, his body protesting every movement. Around him, the remaining soldiers worked silently, clearing debris and tending to the wounded. It was a victory, but only just. The Ralvek had been driven back for now, and their supply corridor remained secure. Yet the cost was staggering, the ground littered with the bodies of those who had fought and fallen. Adrian pushed himself upright, wincing as his leg throbbed under his weight. Colonel Shaw Mazin approached slowly, his movements uncharacteristically subdued. The Terevani leader's iridescent carapace was streaked with soot, and one of his limbs hung at an odd angle, a testament to the battle's ferocity. "Mazin," Adrian said, his voice hoarse, "what's the damage on your end?" "We sustained losses," Mazin admitted. "Several warriors fell. Those who remain are." Unsettled, his antennae twitched as he glanced at Adrian's soldiers, many of whom were still standing despite injuries that would have left most species incapacitated. "You're not the only ones," Adrian replied, scanning the faces of his own team. Mendez was slumped against a wall, his bandaged arm now reinforced with a makeshift brace. Harris, though pale and unsteady, refused to rest, helping the medics patch up their comrades. Mazin's gaze lingered on Harris, his multifaceted eyes reflecting something akin to disbelief. "Your soldiers. They continue to function despite grievous injuries. Some of them should not even be conscious." "Pain's just another problem to solve," Adrian said. "If we can push through it, we do." "At what cost?" Mazin asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Adrian met his gaze. "Sometimes the cost doesn't matter. Sometimes you don't have a choice." Mazin was silent for a moment, his antennae twitching in thought. "Your willingness to endure defies reason. It is not merely a physical trait, it is a philosophy, a refusal to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. We have studied countless species, Colonel Shaw. None share this trait." Adrian shrugged, the movement stiff and painful. "It's what we do. Doesn't mean it's easy." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Crane, who saluted sharply despite the blood trickling down his temple. "Colonel, reinforcements are arriving. Dropships incoming from orbit. They'll be landing within the hour." Adrian nodded. "About time." As the reinforcements landed, fresh soldiers and supplies spilling onto the battlefield, the Terevani gathered in a tight cluster near their fallen comrades. Adrian watched as Mazin gave quiet instructions, the other aliens responding with solemn clicks and murmurs. The reinforcements brought a sense of relief, but for Adrian's team, the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by the full weight of their injuries and exhaustion. Medics worked tirelessly to stabilize the wounded, their expressions grim as they moved from one soldier to the next. Colonel Dr. Lydia Grant appeared at Adrian's side, her medical kit slung over one shoulder. "You need to sit down before you collapse." I'm fine, Adrian said automatically, though the pain in his legs suggested otherwise. Sure you are, Grant muttered, pushing him onto a nearby crate. You've been running on fumes since yesterday. Let me take a look. As she worked, Mazin approached again, his movements hesitant. Colonel Shaw, he began, his tone formal, I wish to express my gratitude. Your actions, and those of your soldiers, ensured our survival. The Ralvek would have overwhelmed us without your resilience. You're welcome, Adrian said, wincing as Grant tightened a bandage around his leg. Mazin's antennae swayed thoughtfully. Your species' capacity for endurance is both remarkable and troubling. You ignore pain, defy logic, and continue when most would have ceased. It is a trait we cannot replicate. That's why we're still here, Adrian said. Mazin tilted his head. Still here. Still alive. Still fighting. Humanity's history is one long story of pushing through the impossible. Pain, setbacks, loss, it's all part of the deal. We don't give up because we can't afford to. The alien leader was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Your species has shown us something we did not expect. We believed pain was a limitation, a directive to cease activity and preserve the self. But for you, it is merely an obstacle. This changes how we view your kind. Adrian leaned back, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. Glad we could clear that up. Mazin's antennae twitched in what might have been amusement. You are a perplexing species, Colonel Shaw. But you are also formidable allies. We will not forget what you have taught us today. With that, the Terevani leader turned and rejoined his warriors, leaving Adrian to his thoughts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first signs of an impending storm began to brew in the sky. Adrian watched the dark clouds gather, knowing there were more battles ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had held the line. They had shown the Terevani what humanity was capable of. And they had proven, once again, that pain was no match for sheer determination.